They thought Karoline Leavitt would fold under pressure. But when she pulled out the receipts and exposed their hypocrisy, live on air, the entire panel fell apart. The invitation arrived 3 days before the broadcast, an unexpected email sitting at the top of Karoline Leavitt's inbox. The subject line was direct: exclusive panel discussion, media accountability in modern politics. A quick scan of the details confirmed what she already suspected. This wasn't an invitation. It was an ambush in disguise. A panel filled with well-known liberal reporters. A discussion on accountability. A primetime slot on one of the biggest networks in the country. Karoline could already predict how it would go. They'd pile on, talk over her, twist her words, and frame her as the outlier. She could have ignored it, moved on. But something about this setup felt different. They were underestimating her, assuming she'd crumble under their weight. That was their first mistake. So she accepted. The studio in Washington, D.C. hummed with quiet urgency as the countdown to live broadcast ticked away. Karoline adjusted the small mic clipped to her blazer, her reflection staring back at her from a glossy monitor nearby. The set was sleek, dark wood, overhead lighting, carefully positioned to cast just the right amount of shadow and contrast. Everything about it screamed manufactured balance, as if the network wanted to appear neutral while ensuring the conversation steered in one direction. The panelists filed in one by one, each greeting her with the kind of polite coldness reserved for a guest they had no intention of treating fairly. Karoline recognized most of them, seasoned media figures, names with decades of influence behind them. She shook their hands anyway, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. At the center of it all sat the moderator, Charles Whitman, a network veteran with a reputation for controlled bias, subtle enough to maintain credibility, sharp enough to guide discussions toward a preferred narrative. "Karoline," he greeted smoothly as he took his seat. "Glad you could make it." "Looking forward to the discussion," she replied, matching his tone. She wasn't. The countdown hit 0. Cameras rolled. A familiar jingle played. The host's voice filled the studio, warm and practiced, welcoming the audience to another thought-provoking debate. It began as expected. Charles framed the discussion as a concern for journalistic integrity, posing the question, is media bias real, or is it just a convenient excuse for those who don't like the coverage they receive? One by one, the panelists spoke, each with carefully worded responses that dismissed concerns of bias as misconceptions, misinterpretations, or bad faith arguments. "Media is about facts," one reporter, Jennifer Langston, stated, "and facts don't have a political agenda." The others nodded in agreement. Karoline listened, patiently, calculating. She knew better than to react too soon. Then Charles turned to her. "Karoline, you've been vocal about media bias in the past. Some would argue that criticism of the press is just an attempt to undermine journalism itself. Do you think there's a real issue, or is this just political theater?" It was bait, an invitation to defend herself rather than discuss the real issue. She didn't take it. Instead, she leaned slightly forward, hands clasped loosely on the table. "There's a real issue," she said evenly. "But it's not just about bias. It's about double standards. When journalists hold one side to an impossible level of scrutiny while excusing the other for the same behavior, that's not just bias, that's dishonesty." The air shifted, subtle, a quiet tightening of expressions around the table. "But," Karoline continued, eyes scanning the panel, "I don't expect you to take my word for it. I brought proof." And just like that, the real conversation began. A small, almost imperceptible shift swept across the table. A flicker of surprise in the moderator's expression. A glance exchanged between two of the panelists. They hadn't expected that. Charles cleared his throat, recovering quickly. "Proof, you say?" His voice carried the usual practiced composure, but there was a tightness to it now. Karoline nodded. "Yes." She reached for a small stack of papers beside her, flipping the first page over with deliberate ease. It wasn't just a prop. She wasn't here to make vague claims and leave room for spin. This was going to be precise, documented, unavoidable. The camera zoomed in slightly, focusing on her as she spoke. "In the last 6 months, we've seen major media outlets run outrage coverage over certain political figures using strong rhetoric, calling it dangerous, divisive, even inciting violence." She set the paper down. Yet when their own preferred politicians use identical language, the same outlets run explainers on why it's taken out of context or misunderstood. Silence. She turned the page. I have articles here written by this very network where one party is accused of threatening democracy for questioning election results. But here's another article, same network, justifying the opposition doing the exact same thing in a previous cycle. I can go on. The room stiffened. One of the panelists, Mark Feldman, a senior political analyst, shifted in his chair, his fingers laced together as if searching for the right way to respond. He cleared his throat. Well, Karoline, I think you're simplifying things quite a bit. Context matters. These situations aren't always one-to-one comparisons. Karoline turned toward him, unfazed. Context matters? Sure, but when the media decides what context is acceptable and what isn't, that's called narrative control. You're proving my point. Mark's lips pressed into a thin line. Jennifer Langston, the reporter who had earlier dismissed bias as a misconception, jumped in. Karoline, let's be honest. Media outlets report facts. Some stories deserve more scrutiny than others based on impact. If one political figure is under fire more than another, maybe it's because their actions warrant it. Karoline let out a short breath through her nose. Not a laugh, but close. So scrutiny is based on impact? That's interesting. She turned another page. Because I also brought data on how major networks prioritize scandals. A study conducted last year analyzed the airtime spent covering political controversies. And guess what? When a conservative figure was accused of wrongdoing, unverified accusations, by the way, it dominated primetime coverage for 2 weeks straight. But when nearly identical accusations surfaced against a liberal politician, a passing mention, 15 seconds, buried in the second half of a segment. She placed the paper down. That's not prioritizing based on impact. That's selecting who gets scrutiny based on preference. Mark shifted again. Charles leaned back slightly in his chair, the measured neutrality of a good moderator slipping. Just a little. The tension in the air thickened, not in an obvious dramatic way, but in the kind that makes a person conscious of every camera, every live broadcast signal transmitting their reaction in real time. Jennifer wasn't done. All right, Karoline, let's test your argument. She sat up straighter, as if preparing to turn the tables. If bias is as bad as you say, why do so many independent fact-checkers back up the stories you're criticizing? Karoline exhaled slowly, shaking her head. Fact-checkers? She let the word settle before adding, you mean the same fact-checkers that mysteriously label one side's falsehoods as misleading or lacking context, while the other sides are called outright dangerous lies? Jennifer didn't respond. Karoline let the pause linger, just long enough for the audience at home to process it themselves. Charles finally spoke up. Karoline, to be fair, fact-checking organizations are independent entities. They don't take marching orders from the media. Karoline turned toward him, her eyes sharp. Then explain this. She picked up another sheet. Why did multiple major fact-checkers quietly update their verdicts after the political winds shifted without acknowledging the change? Why did headlines accusing someone of spreading debunked conspiracies suddenly get revised months later to say, actually, new evidence has surfaced? If it was false then, it should be false now. If it's true now, then they misled the public before. Which one is it? The moderator blinked. The panelist didn't jump in this time, because there was no clean, media-friendly answer to that question. But the silence couldn't last forever, and Karoline wasn't done yet. The studio wasn't silent. Not exactly. There was the faint hum of the overhead lights, the quiet rustle of papers, the almost imperceptible shift of bodies adjusting in their seats. But the usual rhythm of a panel discussion, the smooth flow of rebuttals, the comfortable back and forth of like-minded voices, had stalled. And Karoline could feel it. Charles, the moderator, cleared his throat again. He had done that 3 times now, a reflex maybe, or a subtle attempt to regain control. He straightened in his chair, latching onto the first escape route he could find. All right, let's step back for a second. Karoline, you're making a broad argument about media bias, but let's be honest, every outlet has some level of perspective. That's human nature. Isn't it unfair to paint an entire industry with one brush? She could tell he was trying to shift the framing, make her seem unreasonable, like she was the one stretching the truth. So she didn't flinch, didn't waver. Instead, she smiled. That's a fair question, she said, voice even. So let's make this simple. She reached down beside her, grabbing a tablet she had placed out of sight until now. She tapped the screen, and the studio's main monitor flickered to life behind her. Since we're talking about fairness, let's take a look at some real-time examples. The shift in the room was instant. Jennifer's eyes darted to the screen. Mark crossed his arms, one foot tapping against the carpeted floor. Charles turned his head slightly, already bracing himself. The video began playing. First clip, a well-known anchor from this very network, outraged over a conservative politician's inflammatory statement, calling it unacceptable rhetoric that threatens our democracy. The video cut. Second clip, a liberal politician using the exact same rhetoric months earlier. But this time, the same anchor described it as a strong and necessary response to dangerous extremism. The panelists knew where this was going now. The audience at home knew where this was going now, and Karoline let it play out. The next clip showed a breaking news segment condemning reckless election denialism. The host, with practiced concern, called it a dangerous attack on democracy. Cut. Another video, this time, the same network justifying election denialism when it came from the other side, saying it was important to ask questions, and that no democracy should operate without scrutiny. The hypocrisy wasn't just implied, it was staring them in the face. Charles leaned forward, his hands clasped now. His jaw was tight, his expression unreadable. But Karoline saw the way his eyes flickered toward the producers behind the cameras. They were scrambling. Mark was the first to crack. Look, Karoline, you're cherry picking. We're talking about two different situations here. Context? Context, she repeated, cutting him off. Right, because context only matters when it benefits one side. Mark exhaled sharply through his nose. You're being deliberately simplistic. Karoline raised an eyebrow. You're right. Let's not be simplistic. Let's go deeper. She tapped the tablet again. Another clip. A well-respected journalist, just last year, passionately arguing that political violence was never justified. A moment later, another clip. That same journalist, just months later, saying that some protests may require escalation to be heard. Karoline set the tablet down. She didn't need to say anything. The studio did the work for her. Jennifer was visibly uncomfortable now. Charles was adjusting his tie. Mark's arms were still crossed, but his shoulders were tighter. This wasn't supposed to happen. They were supposed to control the conversation, guide it, contain it. But Karoline had done something they hadn't expected. She had brought receipts, and more importantly, she had played them on their own network. Jennifer, ever the professional, tried one last time. Karoline, I think we're losing sight of the bigger picture here. The media isn't perfect, but it serves a crucial role. If you erode trust in journalism, what's left? Do we just abandon facts entirely? Karoline let that sit for a second. Then she leaned forward. Trust isn't something you demand, she said. It's something you earn. And right now, she motioned toward the screen. You haven't earned it. Jennifer blinked. No one else spoke. Because what could they say? But this wasn't over yet. Karoline was just getting started. The silence stretched, not the usual kind that comes in debates, where someone pauses just long enough to collect their thoughts before launching into a rehearsed response. This was different. A silence weighted by the reality that the usual tactics weren't working. And Karoline knew it. Charles finally spoke, his voice measured, but there was a stiffness to it now. All right, Karoline, you've made your point about double standards. But let's talk about responsibility. The media plays a role in holding people accountable. What happens when we don't scrutinize those in power? What's the alternative? A classic pivot. She recognized it instantly. Redirect the conversation away from hypocrisy and back toward justification. Karoline exhaled, leaning back in her chair, as if she had all the time in the world. Accountability, she repeated, rolling the word over her tongue like she was testing it. That's interesting. She reached for another sheet of paper. Because when a certain political figure's misstep makes headlines for 10 straight days, under the guise of accountability, but an equally serious scandal involving someone on the other side is barely mentioned. That's not accountability. That's protection. Mark let out a scoff, shaking his head. Come on, Karoline. The idea that there's some grand conspiracy to protect one side is ridiculous. If a story is newsworthy, it gets covered. Karoline turned to him, tilting her head slightly. Is that so? She tapped on the tablet again. Another clip played on the monitor. A whistleblower story ignored for months by mainstream outlets, dismissed as misinformation and unverified. Then months later, after undeniable proof surfaced, the same outlets quietly reported it, but then only after it was impossible to ignore. No apologies, no corrections, just a casual revision of history. Mark didn't respond. Karoline continued. What about when major news organizations spike stories that could hurt their preferred candidates, only to release them conveniently after an election? Or when a network knowingly runs with a false narrative, refuses to correct it, and only addresses it years later, after the damage is done? Jennifer interjected, her voice sharper now. That's speculation. There's no proof networks are deliberately spiking stories. Karoline raised an eyebrow. Really? She pulled out a leaked internal memo, a real one, verified. It had surfaced last year, showing a major news outlet ordering journalists to downplay a specific scandal because it might feed the wrong narrative. She held it up. Jennifer froze. Charles shifted in his seat. Mark glanced toward the producers behind the cameras. He knew this wasn't looking good. Karoline let the moment breathe. You want to talk about responsibility, she said finally. Fine, let's talk about it. But responsibility doesn't just apply to politicians. It applies to you. When the media decides which facts the public deserves to know and which ones they should ignore, you aren't holding power accountable. You are the power. The tension in the room was palpable now. For the first time in the discussion, Charles didn't try to pivot, because there was nowhere left to pivot to. Jennifer pressed her lips together. Mark was staring down at the table, and Charles, the seasoned moderator who had kept control of countless debates before, looked like he wanted this segment to end. Karoline didn't smirk, didn't gloat. She didn't need to, because she had already won, but she wasn't done yet. The final blow was coming. The tension was no longer just simmering, it was boiling. Even through the bright studio lights and carefully neutral expressions, Karoline could see it. The shifting of weight in their seats, the tightening of jaws, the way Charles gripped his pen a little harder than before. They had lost control of the conversation, and they knew it. Jennifer tried again, her voice carrying a sharper edge now. All right, Karoline, let's assume for the sake of argument that the media has made mistakes. That doesn't mean there's some coordinated effort to push an agenda. Journalists work hard to report the facts as accurately as possible. Karoline didn't hesitate. Then explain this. She reached for one last document, a list of high-profile retractions and corrections made by major news outlets over the past 5 years. She held it up for the cameras. Why is it, she asked, that every single one of these mistakes only ever seems to go in one direction? Why do retractions always come too late after the damage is done? Why do fact checks apply one standard to one party and a completely different one to the other? Jennifer opened her mouth, then closed it. Mark was staring at the table now, arms still crossed, but his silence was louder than any rebuttal. Charles tried one last time to steer things back under control. Karoline, media is a fast-moving industry. Sometimes in the rush to break news, errors happen, but that's just the nature of journalism. Karoline didn't let him off the hook. Then why do the errors always serve the same narrative? Why do misinterpretations always cut one way? Why do the headlines that turn out to be false get front-page coverage, but the corrections barely make a footnote? She let the weight of that hang. Then she delivered the final blow. You're not just reporters, she said, voice steady. You're narrative engineers. You don't inform the public. You curate their reality. The impact hit the room like a shockwave. Jennifer's lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers curling slightly on the desk. Mark shifted in his chair, glancing toward the producers as if searching for an out. But there was no escape from what had just happened. The audience at home saw it. The millions watching online would see it. Because this wasn't just another panel discussion. This was a reckoning. Charles exhaled slowly, the faintest hint of defeat in his posture. He turned to the camera, forcing a tight smile. Well, I think we've had quite the discussion today. That was his signal. The producers had had enough. The segment was over. The cameras stopped rolling. The microphones clicked off. But the real fallout, that was just the beginning. The moment the cameras stopped rolling, the illusion of composure cracked. Jennifer was the first to stand, snatching her earpiece off with a sharp tug. Mark exhaled through his nose, running a hand down his face before muttering something under his breath. Charles leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as if he could physically press away the disaster that had just unfolded. Karoline stayed seated, calm, unbothered, because she had seen this before, the way people react when they lose control of the narrative. One of the producers, a woman with a tight ponytail and an even tighter expression, strode onto the set, headset still clipped to her belt. We're cutting that segment early for the online replays, she said, her tone clipped. We'll edit for clarity. Karoline nearly laughed. Edit for clarity? That was code for damage control. She stood, smoothing her blazer. You can cut whatever you want, she said evenly, but the full broadcast is already out there. People saw it, and they'll keep seeing it. Jennifer turned sharply. You act like you just exposed some grand conspiracy, Karoline, but all you did was play gotcha clips. Karoline met her gaze. If they weren't hypocritical, there wouldn't be any gotcha moments to clip. Jennifer's mouth opened, then shut, because there was no comeback for that. A low murmur rippled through the crew. Some were avoiding eye contact. Others were watching Karoline, not with disdain, but with something closer to respect. Because deep down, they all knew the truth. And so did the millions of people who had just watched it unfold in real time. By the time Karoline stepped outside the studio, her phone was blowing up. Missed calls, texts, notifications piling in so fast they froze her screen. The clip was already going viral. She scrolled through the flood of posts. She just destroyed the entire panel on live TV. This is unreal. They didn't even try to fight back after a certain point. They knew they were caught. Watch them try to bury this, save the video now before it disappears for violating guidelines. Karoline smirked. They were right to save it, because within the hour, something predictable happened. The network's social media accounts only posted carefully edited clips, trimming down the segment, cutting out the parts that hit too hard. News articles began appearing, downplaying what had happened, calling it an intense exchange, instead of the humiliation it really was. But it didn't matter, because the full, unedited version was already out there, thousands of times over. And once the internet grabs something, it doesn't let go. By the evening, cable news was already reacting. Some tried to spin it, others ignored it. But independent media, online voices, they were having a field day. A popular commentator streamed a reaction live. Folks, this wasn't just a debate. This was a reckoning. She came in prepared. She shut them down, and they had nothing, no real answers. Just excuses. Another clipped segment racked up 1 million views in just 2 hours. Karoline watched it all unfold from her hotel room, sipping coffee as she flipped through the channels. They thought this would be an easy win, a routine public shaming of a dissenting voice. But they had made a mistake. They underestimated her. And now, the truth was out there, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The next morning, the fallout hit full force. Karoline woke up to headlines spinning in every direction. Some called her ruthless. Others accused her of manipulating the conversation. A few tried to downplay the moment entirely, acting as if nothing significant had happened. But the view counts didn't lie. The unedited clip had already passed 5 million views overnight. Independent commentators were breaking it down frame by frame, exposing every contradiction, every shift in body language, every moment the panelists realized they were losing control. And the network? They were in full damage control mode. She flipped through channels, watching as panelists from the same network now discussed how the real issue wasn't the debate itself, but the dangerous rise of misinformation. There it was, the classic move. When they can't deny what happened, they redirect. They don't address the substance. They attack the person who exposed it. Karoline sipped her coffee, barely reacting. She had expected this. It was always the next step. Her phone buzzed. Another notification. She glanced at the screen. A well-known independent journalist had just posted, "Breaking. Sources inside the network say producers were panicking after last night's segment. Some wanted to cut it from reruns entirely, but they knew it was too late. The internet had already taken over." Karoline smiled. That's why they were scrambling. They had spent years controlling narratives, deciding what the public could and couldn't focus on. But this time, they weren't in control anymore. Later that day, her team forwarded an email from the network, a formal request for a follow-up segment. They wanted her back on air. The wording was careful, measured. They framed it as continuing the discussion, as if this was just a healthy exchange of ideas. But Karoline knew better. They weren't asking for a discussion. They were asking for a chance to clean up the mess. Her team debated it. Some thought she should go back, hold them accountable again. Others warned it was a trap. Karoline took a breath, considering. She had already done what needed to be done. The truth was out there now, and if the network wanted damage control, they'd have to do it without her. She declined, because they needed her more than she needed them. By the end of the week, something bigger was happening. Politicians and media figures were being asked on live TV about what happened that night. Do you think Karoline Leavitt was right? Should the media be held to the same standards it applies to others? Some dodged, some fumbled through weak defenses. But one thing was clear, the moment wasn't dying down. The conversation had shifted, not because the media allowed it, but because the people demanded it, and that was the part they never saw coming. A week had passed, but the ripple effect was still spreading. What started as a single segment had turned into a national conversation. Not just about media bias, but about trust, about who controls the narrative, about what happens when the people they claim to inform stop believing them. Karoline had expected backlash. She didn't expect what came next. A major news outlet, not the one she had debated on, but a competitor, ran an editorial. The headline? Has the media lost its grip on the public? It was carefully worded, still defensive, still reluctant to admit fault. But the fact that they were even asking the question? That was a shift. The people who spent years dismissing accusations of bias were suddenly acknowledging that trust was eroding because they didn't have a choice. The numbers were in. Surveys showed public confidence in mainstream media had hit an all-time low. Viewership on alternative platforms was surging. More people were tuning into independent analysts than ever before. Karoline knew what that meant. The network she had humiliated wasn't just worried about one bad night. They were worried about what came next. Because if enough people wake up, if enough people see through the illusion, the whole system collapses. Despite the media frenzy, Karoline had kept her distance. She turned down follow-up invitations, ignored smear pieces trying to paint her as dangerous or reckless. She didn't need to defend herself. The truth was already doing the work for her. One night, as she scrolled through messages from supporters, a thought crossed her mind. They'll never learn. The media had a chance to reflect, to acknowledge their own hypocrisy, to rebuild trust. But instead, they were doubling down, blaming the public for falling for misinformation, insisting that alternative voices were the real danger. They were proving her right again. But Karoline wasn't angry. She was prepared, because the more they tried to silence the truth, the louder it became. And if they thought this was the end, they hadn't been paying attention, because this was just the beginning. If you're tired of being told what to think, if you're done letting corporate media decide what's true and what's not, share this video. Let people see for themselves. Because the moment we stop questioning, they win. And if there's one thing they fear the most, it's a public that refuses to be controlled.